Howdy again everyone, and today I'm testing out a new lens for Fujifilm's X-mount aps-c cameras, a lens which I'm very familiar with after testing it on medium format. Here's the XF 500mm f5.6 R LM OIS WR. Fujifilm have taken the original GF lens, which performed so well on medium format, and changed its colour and put an X mount on the bottom. This is advantageous for Fujifilm as they can release the lens on both systems at once and save a bit of design cost that way. It's a bit of a disadvantage to consumers though, because it means the lens is probably bigger and more expensive than it could have been if it was designed from the ground up just for cameras with a much smaller aps-c sensor. But whatever, it's still a very welcome addition to the XF lineup as far as I'm concerned. This XF version of the lens is at least cheaper than the GF version at $3,000 instead of $3,500 or £2,900 here in the UK. That makes it about $1,000 more than Fujifilm's 150 to 600mm lens, which has a longer range, but an aperture only half as bright. So this 500mm lens is expensive, but if it is as fantastically sharp on XF as it was on GF, it could be worth it for bird and wildlife photographers, as well as sports photographers who are willing to shoot at high ISO levels. It's the full frame equivalent of 760mm or so this is long telephoto all the way. I'd like to thank Fujifilm UK very much for loaning me this lens and a 40MP X-T5 camera for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review. Although the lens is easily one of the biggest on a Fujifilm X system, it's not quite as heavy as it looks like it should be. At 1.3 kilograms it's quite hand-holdable, and I found it comfortable to shoot with out in the field. Its construction is a mixture of metal and plastic to keep the weight down, and it's well weather sealed with a nice gasket around the rear mount. Then comes a heavy-duty metallic tripod mount. It's well designed, easy and smooth to turn, and the bottom part can be removed to save on weight when carrying the lens around with you. Then comes side controls for the autofocus, focus presetting and image stabilization. Here's some footage for you with stabilization turned off and now turned on, where you can see it's making a big difference. At a focal length like this, you can't expect a rock steady image. Then comes an aperture ring, which has nice positive clicks every third of an f-stop and can also be locked in or out of automatic mode, a useful feature. Then comes the rubberized manual focus ring, which again turns lovely and smoothly. The focus response to turning that ring is a bit jerky on big focus pulls, like on other Fuji system lenses. In terms of focus breathing, the lens zooms in a bit as you focus more closely to your subject. The lens's autofocus motor runs quickly, quietly and accurately. I found on the X-T5 a bit of hunting, unfortunately, but when it finds your subject it locks on and tracks quite happily. I found that the X-T5 camera was able to locate subjects for tracking quite easily, but the autofocus system itself wasn't always able to keep up the pace, and I got quite a few missed shots when doing bird photography. My keeper rate was about 30% for bird photos, not in flight. I was able to get plenty of keepers, which looked fantastic, especially with the X-T5's 40MP sensor, but I know that other camera systems can do a bit better than this. The lens has a 95mm filter thread size and comes with a decent sized plastic hood with a hole for adjusting your filters. Overall, the build quality is excellent here. The extensive weather sealing is a nice bonus too. Its autofocus is fine and its image stabilization is very good as well. I'm glad it's not too heavy either. More importantly though, image quality. I'm testing it out today on a 40MP aps-c camera, the Fujifilm X-T5. These are images with Fuji's in-camera corrections turned on. Straight from f5.6, image quality is brilliantly sharp in the middle with excellent contrast, and over in the corners, wow, virtually as good. If you stop down to f8, then you even get a tiny, minuscule little extra boost in sharpness, but it's so subtle you might not notice it through YouTube's compression. As usual, for any lens on a 40MP aps-c sensor, if you stop down to f11 or f16, then diffraction softens your image. But overall, this is a stellar performance, especially when you take into consideration that the X-T5's sensor is one of the most demanding on the market today. It's also a fair bit sharper than the Fujifilm 150 to 600mm zoom lens, even when shooting at f5.6, so in terms of image quality, you are at least getting what you pay for here. Let's bypass Fujifilm's automatic corrections by shooting in RAW and processing with third-party software in order to look for distortion and vignetting. No real distortion is visible here, although surprisingly, considering that this is a medium format lens on aps-c, we are seeing just a tiny touch of vignetting at f5.6. Stop down to f8 and those corners brighten up fully, but really, it's barely even noticeable. This lens's minimum focus distance is about 2.8 meters, so its magnification is very good on an aps-c camera for shooting smaller subjects. At f5.6, close-up image quality remains sharp, although we see a lot of blue color fringing on contrasting edges here. Stop down to f8 though, and it quickly goes away. Let's see how the lens performs against bright lights. It's a fairly good performance here, with soft flaring only really emerging when bright lights are directly in your image. Next, bokeh. As you will have seen by now, this lens is happily capable of really throwing your backgrounds out of focus. Those backgrounds look pretty soft to me, with no real noticeable problems. Okay, well, overall, the Fujifilm 500mm f5.6 was an astonishingly good lens on medium format, and thankfully it retains its excellent image quality on X mount. To be getting images this sharp on a 40MP sensor at 500mm is a major achievement. Granted, you have to pay through the nose for it, and Fujifilm's bird detection autofocus still needs a bit of tweaking, but when it is properly in focus, the results you do get are basically spectacular. For serious wildlife and sports photographers, this 500mm prime optic could well be worth the premium over the 150 to 600mm zoom lens for 3 reasons. Firstly, it's smaller and lighter, making it easier to shoot with. Secondly, it's a fair bit sharper. And thirdly, its aperture is twice as bright, which is especially important on a 40MP camera, as their high ISO noise levels are a little worse, and diffraction begins to soften your images when stopping your aperture down darker than f5.6. So while the 500mm lens's price is very expensive, I can still highly recommend it for bird and wildlife photographers who've chosen the Fujifilm X system, and who have deep pockets, of course. That was fun. Fujifilm cameras might not be the first thing you think of for bird and wildlife photography, but when you get your subject in focus, that extra aps-c reach and those 40MP sensors are pretty spectacular. Anyway, a special thanks to all my Patreon supporters who make such a big difference to keeping this YouTube channel going. Check out my Patreon page in the description below, where supporters get all kinds of exclusive bonus content. Ciao for now, everyone.